New speaker to start the debate.
Sorry,
Well, we can use this extra time well.
Madam Speaker, every day that the Muslim Brotherhood continues its protest against the government of Adly Mansour, that is another day that provides an excuse for generals and the secularists within Egypt to push to ban that party. We think that every day that those protests continue, it allows the army to try and wind back democracy a tiny bit more and argue that democracy does not work in Egypt and democracy is not an end game for the Egyptian people. We think that it is in the interests of the Muslim Brotherhood to accept these cabinet positions and end their protests against the government and the army. We think, moreover, it is in the interests of democracy that this be accepted. So even if the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't think it's best for them, we think they should do it anyway in the interests of protecting Egyptian democracy. I've got a few issues in substantive. So firstly, I'm going to tell you about how cooperating is good for protecting Egyptian democracy from the army. Secondly, about how cooperating is good for protecting Egyptian democracy from the polarisation that will result otherwise. And thirdly, about how cooperating is good for allowing the Muslim Brotherhood to continue as a legitimate force in Egypt. So firstly, why do we think that cooperating is good for protecting democracy for the Muslim Brotherhood? Because we think firstly that the army does not trust the Muslim Brotherhood to run that state, and it does not trust the Muslim Brotherhood to cooperate with it in an effective way. Why is this? Because what we saw in Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood was that they tried to wrest back control of some important institutions from the army, and they tried to reform some institutions in ways that the army found displeasing to them. We think that the army is not likely to accept a party or government that it views as being detrimental to its sway on Egyptian democracy, and that views it as not being a legitimate institution within that democracy. Why, though, do we think that the army is a continuing threat if the Muslim Brotherhood does not accept this? For a few reasons. Firstly, we think that because the army has engaged in a coup against a Muslim Brotherhood-led government before, it is likely to do so again. Because it views the result of democracy as being that the Muslim Brotherhood will take control, because they were the most popular and popularly supported party within that democracy. And that means that whenever there is a democracy, there will be a continuing threat to the role of the military. Secondly, though, we think that they have an incentive to engage in those coups if the Muslim Brotherhood takes power, because they want to protect their interests. So we recognise that in Egypt, 40% of the GDP of that nation is controlled by the military, and we think that that is an interest that they want to protect and view as threatened by a political party that does not view them as the legitimate institution of Egyptian democracy. Thirdly, we think that they have ideological reasons to oppose the Muslim Brotherhood. So we think that the army has developed a secular and largely anti-Islamic ideology for a few reasons. This was firstly during the dictatorship that preceded the Muslim Brotherhood, because it was fed to that military that it had to squash out these Islamist forces within that nation. But secondly, we think it was something that was reinforced by the military aid that has been given to Egypt throughout its history by the US, that it was something that they wanted to protect a secular state, not an Islamic state. These are the reasons that we think the military will always view Egyptian democracy as being a threat to them, whilst the Muslim Brotherhood does not does not cooperate in this democracy. But what we think is that if the Muslim Brotherhood takes these key cabinet positions, or cabinet positions that have been offered to them, that makes the army much less likely to engage in this anti-democratic sort of extrajudicial ways of getting rid of governments. Why is that? Because we think, firstly, this current government by Adly was largely created by the army. So we think that the army has said that you can allow the Muslim Brotherhood positions on this, and that will be something that they're perfectly okay with. Secondly, though, we think it demonstrates that the Muslim Brotherhood will cooperate with the army, and that it's a gesture of goodwill to the military, saying that they view them as still having a legitimate role within that state. So we think it accepts the legitimacy and would mean that the Muslim Brotherhood would be the army would be more likely to cooperate with the Muslim Brotherhood into the future. Secondly, though, we think that if the Muslim Brotherhood weren't to accept this position, or these positions, it would lead to furthering polarisation within Egyptian democracy, and that would be bad for that democracy. Why is that? Because we think the Egyptian state has devolved into two polarised groups within that state. So we see that there are the Morsi supporters, which have been largely Muslim Brotherhood supporters. We think that the Salafists have got behind the Morsi government as well, because they view Islamist democracy as something they want. On the other hand, we see that there are secularists and Coptics and liberals who view their rights as always being threatened by those Islamic parties. We think that these groups are incredibly afraid of each other, and neither is going to accept the legitimacy of a government that is formed with only that party involved, because of the proportion of the split, and because of the fact that they are so afraid of the effects of the other. Moreover, though, we think that each of these groups has the levers within the Egyptian state to disrupt a government and democracy that consists of the other. So we point to the fact that the secularists and liberals generally control the institutions of the courts and the army, whereas the Muslim Brotherhood have a more populist and popular backing within that state that can disrupt democracy. We think that when you allow these people, when you make these people cooperate, that is going to change that polarisation, because it means both sides will be able to see some legitimacy within that government. As a result, we think we'll improve the relations between those groups, because it leads to them being seen to cooperate with each other and not to be violent. We think it will reduce the it makes the violent clashes between these groups less likely, because they're working together to get better outcomes. And finally, we think that a grand coalition ensures that all of the people in Egypt are represented in forming the new institutions, such as the courts and the constitution, because it means that people can have their views represented by cabinet members within that state. Finally, why do we think cooperating is good for the Muslim Brotherhood? Because we think what is in the interest, firstly, of democracy is in the interests of the Muslim Brotherhood, because they do have that popular backing, which means that a functioning democracy is likely to deliver them a degree of support that can continue into the future. But secondly, we think that the Muslim Brotherhood will be marginalised if they don't cooperate, because they won't be involved in writing things like election laws, which will determine future districting and stuff like that, and they're not involved in creating those first institutions. But secondly, we think that not cooperating gives the secularists and the army an excuse to ban that party, because it is viewed as not wanting to cooperate with them and being something that is antithetical to that democracy. Madam Speaker, we think that it is in the interest of Egyptian democracy and in the interest of the Muslim Brotherhood to accept these cabinet positions we proudly propose.